Date is September 12th, 1862. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia has begun moving out of Frederick in earnest. The wings have separated, so to speak. We've been focusing on General Lee and Longstreet over the last couple days, just touching on South Mountain, which wraps up on September 14th, 1862. So backtracking a little bit, picking up Stonewall Jackson's wing. As they leave Frederick, Maryland, they begin to descend upon 10,000 or so troops, a little bit more here at Harper's Ferry. The garrison at or not garrison, but the troops at Martinsburg having fallen back,
right,
bolstering whatever ranks were here. So we're talking, like I said, 10 to 12,000 troops here at Harper's Ferry. Jackson's beginning to move on them. Take us through the action at Harper's Ferry.
Sure, Pat. Now, on September 12th, we're actually going to have Confederate forces begin arriving here around Harper's Ferry, specifically the division of Lafayette McLaws. Now, McLaws' forces are actually on the other side of this ridge we have out here in the distance. That's the Maryland Heights, and that's part of Elk Ridge. They're on the other side of it in the Pleasant Valley, and they're actually going to move up the Elk Ridge and begin coming down the spine of that long ridge line, heading for the Maryland Heights. It is the dominating high ground here around Harper's Ferry, and it is the key to the Harper's Ferry position. McLaws knows this, and he needs to get troops up there. And on the 12th, he's actually going to run into some problems. Colonel Ford has troops up there on Maryland Heights, and his men are going to do a pretty good job on the 12th, kind of pushing back against these first Confederate probes. Lafayette McLaws' men are going to have some of the hardest terrain to deal with in this campaign, and definitely in this part of the campaign they have the hardest terrain to deal with. There's accounts of these guys moving along an old logging road that was barely existed at that point, and pulling themselves along by various trees and shrubs and things like that.
Yeah.
Anything they could do to kind of progress on this very steep terrain. Now, the 12th, of course, McLaws is going to be up there on Maryland Heights. There is some preliminary skirmishing. The Federals do a pretty good job, but on the 13th, things are going to begin to turn against them. Jackson will have arrived out here towards Schoolhouse Ridge with the other divisions of his command, and John G. Walker's division has now gotten up into position on Loudon Heights there in the distance, and he is going to drag 5 artillery pieces up there to the top of that high ground. So the pieces are beginning to come into play, come into position here around Harper's Ferry. And as Pat said, there's about 12 to 13,000 Federal troops now that the rest of the Martinsburg troops have come down here at Harper's Ferry as the garrison. And the Federal commander here, Dixon Miles, he's in trouble. Pat, why hasn't Miles moved out of here?
He is taking his orders incredibly literally.
Okay.
His orders are to hold Harper's Ferry at all costs.
Right.
To the last. Something you Gettysburg folks should know about. Yeah, he's definitely sitting here because his instructions are to sit here and hold it no matter the threat that's coming. It doesn't matter if it's this nuclear threat of being enveloped by this other force. Sit put. And that's what he's doing here.
That's exactly right. Now on the 13th of September, not only will the other pieces be coming into play, but Lafayette McLaws will capture the Maryland Heights. Again, there in the background. The key to this position. Forcing Ford and his troops off the high ground. Dixon Miles would, of course, claim that he never wanted that to happen, that he wanted the Maryland Heights to be held, but now it's too little too late. There hadn't been enough forces up there to really stop what was coming, and there were no real significant guns up there either. But now the Confederates are going to begin dragging pieces up there. They'll actually break down 4 different cannon and drag them to the top of the Maryland Heights to begin to bombard Harper's Ferry if necessary. And Pat, that's going to become necessary the next day. September 14th, 1862, we're going to see the bombardment of Harper's Ferry begin around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. What's happened is that John G. Walker's division out there on Loudon Heights, he's been itching to unleash his guns on Harper's Ferry, but Jackson has been communicating from Schoolhouse Ridge by Signal Corps, by semaphore flag, up to the Maryland Heights, and then from Maryland Heights down to Walker on the Loudon Heights. So we've got this communications networks of flags out here, and Jackson's telling his commanders, wait for me. Let me get all my guns in position, and we'll open simultaneously.
John G. Walker said, you mean fire right now?
Pretty much, yes. Because around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, he would begin the bombardment. and Schoolhouse Ridge will open up soon after that, about an hour after, and then finally the guns at Maryland Heights would open as well. And unfortunately for Dixon Miles and his men, there is no significant response. While there are federal batteries here at Harper's Ferry, for the most part, the guns that are now raining shot and shell down upon them are firing from too high of an elevation, and the federal guns can't actually bring their barrels up that high.
Try to imagine a professional stadium, like a combo of a baseball and a football stadium, right? Where we as fans sit up in the bleachers nice and high looking down on the action. Well, the action, our playing field, so to speak, is a kind of loose triangle pyramid looking thing where it has a low point, which is the lower town of Harper's Ferry, and it has a high point where we're standing here at Bolivar Heights. It is still dominated by that bleacher section.
Yep.
We have Loudon Heights, Maryland Heights, and Schoolhouse Ridge behind where our camera is facing right now. It doesn't really matter on the coming inside because you have, this is the history things or the science things podcast. Is this one of those moments where we bridge the gap into science? But they've got more artillery range by shooting downhill, so to speak, than
Right.
Miles does by shooting uphill at them. So not much you can do.
Right. Now, one good thing that is occurring on the 14th before the 15th of September is the escape of the Union cavalry. Horse-mounted soldiers are not going to be particularly useful in a siege situation, and the federal cavalry commander is actually going to go to Dixon Miles and ask for permission for his forces to make an attempt to break out. And initially, Miles doesn't want anything to do with it. He wants all of his forces to stay here at Harper's Ferry
And
stay
hold.
concentrated. Exactly.
Everybody hold.
But letting him know, look, our weapons, our carbines and pistols, they're not going to be able to reach out to the Confederate lines. We have all these horses that we don't want the Confederates
Yeah,
to take.
horses are valuable. Remember, Lincoln says, generals I can make, right?
Right.
But horses I cannot, or something like that.
Exactly.
So horses are important.
Horses are extremely important, and there's about 1,400 of them here in Harper's Ferry with the cavalry. And so finally, Dixon Miles will acquiesce and will let the cavalry make the attempt. But he will tell them, don't tell the infantry. And at around 8 p.m., we would actually have the federal cavalry moving across to the pontoon bridge from the lower town of Harper's Ferry across the Potomac River to the C&O Canal. There they would take the C&O Canal towpath to the relative north, and they would begin their escape. They would run into some Confederate pickets, but they would be successful in breaking out, and those troopers will escape the trap that is Harper's Ferry. Jackson himself would later comment about how he really was not happy that the cavalry had gotten away, that those valuable horses had gotten away.
Right.
But that's the one positive
Them
here.
the breaks is what he said, basically. Them the
Exactly.
breaks in warfare. You know, real quick, I kind of had a chuckle as we were listening to Matt here talk about John G. Walker bringing the guns up on the Loudon Heights. That is twice during this campaign that he has been tasked with absolutely crappy construction assignments. Remember,
true.
we just spent a little bit of time with Walker down at the Monocacy Aqueduct. He was supposed to blow it up.
Right.
And that thing was super stubborn, and he was unable to do that. And then he has to, get into action here, mobilize, and catch up with Jackson. And they immediately tasked him with taking guns up the mountain that Dixon Miles didn't bother to defend because the terrain is so wonky.
Yep.
Man, just a construction shout out. As a guy who swung some hammers and nails, John G. Walker had it on this campaign. That's all
Does
I'm saying.
indeed. Now, on the 15th of September, the guns will once again open in the early morning. By this point, the fighting at South Mountain, of course, has ended on the 14th. Confederate forces here around Harper's Ferry had been very concerned about those approaching federal forces, but the presence of some of Lafayette McLaws' men in the Pleasant Valley has stopped the Union 6th Corps from pushing down towards Harper's Ferry, and so on the morning of the 15th, the guns once again open here at Harper's Ferry. Unfortunately for Dixon Miles, the Confederates, though, have been working throughout the night. They have actually brought troops down towards the Shenandoah River and moved along the railroad tracks to come up onto the flank or the side of the Bolivar defensive line, which we're on the upper part of Bolivar right now. Additionally, they have brought more artillery across the Shenandoah River to a piece of high ground, a plateau on that side of the river that will allow those guns to enfilade this defensive line. Initially, once more, Dixon Miles wants to hold. But by 9 o'clock, actually, excuse me, by 8 o'clock, he is going to recognize that the situation is hopeless. He had even stopped some earlier attempts to surrender, but by 8 o'clock, he recognizes the situation is hopeless, and we're going to begin to see white flags pop up along this defensive line along Bolivar. Now, the firing won't actually stop here until almost 9 o'clock. Once again, John G. Walker is doing some of the last firing here, and he comments that he doesn't break off his fire until nearly 9 a.m.
He says, "I can't hear your white flag." What's that? I can't hear you?
That and probably all the smoke here in the valley is obscuring his view. Unfortunately for Dixon Miles, the Union garrison commander here at Harper's Ferry, one of the very last shots of the day will mortally wound him. He's actually going to lose most of the one calf. It takes pretty much the whole back of his leg off. And he is going to be taken down into Harper's Ferry, where he would succumb to his injuries later that day. Now, it would be the former garrison commander of Martinsburg now, Brigadier General White, who will have to put on his finest uniform and go out down just below us here, below Bolivar, to the Confederate commander that's now moving towards Harper's Ferry, Jackson himself. And he would surrender the garrison at that point. The surrender at Harper's Ferry, Pat, why does this resonate with us today? Why is this still something that's extremely important in American military history?
Because up until the Second World War, this is the largest surrender of American troops
That's correct.
in all of time and space and history.
Yep.
It is only the troops that surrender, I believe it's Bataan,
Correct.
in the Second World War in the Pacific Theater against the Empire of Japan,
Yep.
that are a larger surrendering force. So 1 and 2.
Yep. The surrender here at Harper's Ferry, over 12,000 federal troops fall into Confederate hands. They will be paroled. That means that they sign a document stating that on their honor they promise not to fight anymore until they have been notified that they've been exchanged for a Confederate POW.
Scouts honor, guys.
Now, these troops, the vast majority of them are actually sent up to Camp Parole, Maryland, after having their gear taken from them, obviously. And where are they sent after that?
They're sent to a place called Camp Douglas in Chicago. But before we get there, let's talk for a minute about my guys, Marylanders.
Oh, of course.
Marylanders don't have to make this long trip because we're already here, basically.
Yep.
And their instructions are not even to leave the state. They're supposed to fight only within the borders of Maryland, and they're technically caught up here in Virginia.
right.
So instead of making it all the way up to Camp Douglas in Chicago, where the majority of the surrendering federal troops at Harper's Ferry go, they get to stay right here in Maryland and go back to their homes and wherever they are assigned to until they're notified of their later parole. So very different experience than the majority of the troops. So go Maryland, crab cakes and football.
Now, again, as Pat said, this is a massive surrender of federal forces, the largest in American military history up until this point, but it's also going to be a huge boon for the Confederates in supplies. So 12,000 plus federal troops are captured, but 13,000 small arms, 73 cannon, the largest haul of cannons the Confederacy would get at one point during the war, 200 wagons, and sadly about 1,000 freedmen fall into Confederate hands at this point. And where those federal troops were paroled and sent up to Maryland, of course later Chicago, the freedmen and those supplies are now sent south. They're going to be sent towards Winchester, Virginia, a big railroad depot there, and they'll be sent further into the Confederacy from that point. But Pat, following the surrender here, Jackson's going to resupply his forces, but where's he going to go from there?
He's got to get moving because he knows that Lee has been pushed out of the gaps in South Mountain. At this point, everybody here at Harper's Ferry has been listening to the action at South Mountain. We are not that far away. The thunder of the cannons and the rattle of the musketry, potentially, definitely the cannons, maybe the musketry, has echoed through the valleys all the way down here. So they're listening, so they know what's going on. This big fight, this monstrosity of force, this military force, is right here. So I got to go, is basically what Jackson's saying. So he's going to turn to A.P. Hill, who was here today. He was not sick. He was here today. And he's going to say, you got to basically wrap things up here, and then I'll call upon you. But I got to go catch up with Lee at a little place called Sharpsburg, Maryland, which is where this story has kind of been building to all along. I'm very excited, Matt. For those of you who are going to be watching this, we are going to stop with the pre-production stuff. We are going to be live. So the next segment of this will be at Antietam National Battlefield on September 17th. We'll be getting out there and broadcasting beginning around 6:30ish or so. But you're going to want to make sure you do that right here on YouTube. So if you are following along on our social media, History Things podcast on Facebook or Instagram, make sure you get onto our YouTube channel and follow along with our live coverage in the evening of September 17th itself.